So good morning, everybody. So we're here on June 2nd. So this is our one weekly meeting about the ESSERF funds that are part of the CARES Act. And I'm not sure that we have a ton of updates unless, JC, do you know if we've heard back on any of our questions to the program person at USDOE?
As of last night, no.
Okay. So continue to send those questions in. And so I think basically everybody is on mute already. So, but I'll just point out that, I ask you to stay on mute except for if you raise your hand, and then you can certainly unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can certainly throw that question into the chat as we do have one already. So Patty is asking, would you clarify are PPE and sanitation supplies being purchased by the state for school units, or does that expense need to be included in the ESSER application? Also, are there additional funds expected from the feds? So I know at least at this point in time, we don't know of any other. I don't know of any other funding from the feds, or nothing that's certainly been passed at the federal level. I mean, there are certainly a number of bills that are both the House and Senate of the U.S. legislatures that have been proposed. Those will certainly have to go through their process before we see anything signed by the president. But nothing that I'm aware of as additional funding. JC, were you in on as far as I know the Safety Center is doing some PPE purchases. I'm not exactly sure how that process is actually working, but I do know that they are doing some purchases, essentially to ensure that we don't have schools competing against each other for price. But do you know what the Yep.
I'm going to record that question.
Okay.
I do know that Jonathan Shapiro is having discussions with DAFs so that they might do a bulk setup. I just don't know whether at this time the individual school administrative units need to put money aside, and I'm not sure what the per mask cost is. So I will record that question. We will try and get that answered in the next couple of days. Okay.
And I do know he sent an email out at least to some school units, but I'm not. I don't know anything beyond what that email says.
Right. I think Chelsea and I can double check with him.
Yep.
Chelsea's now on.
Yep. I see that. So she's now showing up in my feed, and of course once I turn over letting people in, I don't know who's coming into the meeting anymore. So Teresa's asking, when we submit our application, does it need to be for the total allocation, or can we submit a partial application now and a partial application later?
So the federal program application portal is programmed in such a way that it needs to be for the total amount. So your budget page will have to include all of the funding that you'll receive. The deadline, that's a question that's becoming popular. It's a rolling basis. So we know that many of you are currently engaging in conversations about next year's budget. And you're going to need a little bit more time. So what happens in the application portal is that once you submit to us, the entire ESSERF team gets communication that you've submitted, and it must be reviewed. So on the DOE's end, we meet daily to review any submitted applications, and the team reviews and discusses that content and is able to provide approval as a group. If you put money in a specific federal program, you'll receive approval, or it'll be opened by that program team leader. Some things that we've noticed the past week or so, we have about almost a dozen applications that have been submitted, and we've noticed that a lot of them are talking about devices. and meeting the needs of students. For some, we've had to come back and call the person that put the application in to have a conversation about the pending purchase for, devices through gear and the money for ESSER. So a few districts have said, oh, I didn't think about the gear funding when I put this in. I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a revision because now this allows me to use my ESSER funding for other priorities. And then other districts said, no, absolutely, I hear that, but we still have this enormous need and we're wanting to use our funds to buy specific types of devices for our students. And so really it's just a phone call, not to check up on you, but to make sure that we're providing the support and technical assistance that you may need. And if you have questions about the gear orders, one was made this week. So if you're wondering, am I a part of that order, send an email to Paige and or Beth Lambert. I'll put their email accounts in the chat box and they can follow up with you. The other thing to consider is that there's some work that your tech director does need to do on the back end to accept the devices. So if it seems like it's been a little while and you're wondering why, it might be helpful not only to check in with Beth Lambert and Paige Nichols, but also to check in with your tech director.
So while you peruse the other questions, Chelsea, that you may be able to answer, but so I did want to note, I did get some questions from business managers around. I noticed that they were noticing that there's some ways in which they were thinking, or their districts were thinking of spending the money, and I hadn't marked them off in any one of the categories, or I hadn't included them in the sheet, and so I tried to do my best as to what I could think of how you would spend the money, and mark those with a category. But just because it's not marked doesn't mean it's not allowable. It could very well just be that I didn't think of it as a possibility. So I think, so in the email of when I put that out, I noted that, I'll update this as I need to. And so certainly as things get submitted into the application and I notice that, oh, I didn't think of that, and how, and how that would be coded, I'll add those into that other clarification sheet so that, but this is a bit of, because we don't know how the school districts are going to think of spending all this money, I couldn't mark every possible allowability down.
Another question I have in the chat, is there an allowed amount for a grant coordinator? So the rules for admin are, as they always are through federal funds, we have to ask ourselves, is it reasonable and is it necessary? I can tell you that there is a grant application that has been approved with funding for someone to manage the program. So it's absolutely possible, but it's the reasonable and necessary check. Can the application be changed in, say, 3 months down the line? Yes, if you still have funding remaining. Excuse me, my apprentice came to check in. She said we're doing okay. If you need to change it in 3 months, you'll have to send us an email and we'll gladly open it for you. And you'll be able to make changes based on the funding that you currently have available in the reimbursement system. The question, Giselle, around PPE, we will absolutely follow up with Jonathan from the Maine School Safety Center later this morning and follow up with you folks via email.
And so that seems to be what Joy's question is around as well. So, so Bridget is asking, we are not ready to submit our application and probably won't be until this summer. We have identified something we want the grant to cover, but that needs to be purchased now. Is it possible to change expenditures in the ESSER grant in the current fiscal year and show an accounts receivable at year end, even though the actual application has not been submitted? So do you want to take as far as, well, so you can certainly, I mean, so the application, the expenditures, as long as they're occurring after March 13th would be allowable. as far as, I mean, so how you're accounting for it, Bridget, I think is actually more of a conversation um, to have with your auditor on how that would need to be shown in your accounting. But do you want to talk, Chelsea, about, I mean, the fact that they're going to make the purchase, but their application hasn't been submitted?
I think it's a really good question though, right? So for those of us that have been in federal programs for some time together, the question is really about obligation and when can I make an obligation? And typically you can't make an obligation until you've actually received approval. But because this is education stabilization funding, and in the federal FAQs, they stated anything on or after March 13th, so long as you know it will be approved, you should be okay. Now, if you put something or you purchase something that won't be approved, that is not an allowable use, and then later try to get reimbursement, you wouldn't get the reimbursement because it wasn't in your approved application. But if you're purchasing something that has been outlined in the dozen or so categories, and we've clearly written down for you that it is allowable, you shouldn't have a problem because we are in June and well past the March 13th, stake in the ground. But really good question, because you've been in federal programs for so long, you know those rules about obligation and you want to make sure you follow them. And if you change something, you need to hear from us that that's okay.
So, and then Sue is asking the question, can they make changes after it's been approved? And so their priorities shift once the school's open. And so, yes, you can, if you submit your application now and your priorities change, and you still have funding left, then you can certainly use those remaining funds in a new way by asking for your application to be reopened and getting, those new priorities approved.
I do want to go back again to the dates, right? So some of the applications that have been submitted speak of the past. So we purchased X, Y, and Z. When you speak of the past, please put in the date that you purchased them. It will save all of us from having to go back in and to revise it, because what we need to know is, was the past March 13th on or after? And we won't be able to approve it without those details. So if you get a quick note, an email from us, just to say, I'm opening it so that you can put in those details, that's what it's about. It's doing that double check to make sure that it's within the allowable time frame. I have another private message. Chelsea, any news on my electronic sign question? I know there's now about a half a dozen of you that have asked that question. And unfortunately, the only response we've received from the U.S. Department of Education was regarding the application needing to go out for public comment. We have not received responses on any of the other submitted questions, and nor have we received a template for the initial report that is due in mere days. So I continue to email our program coordinator at the U.S. Department of Ed, and we'll make sure that we update the FAQ documents once we have any more information. I just want you to be sure that you know we updated the FAQs last week based on some additional information that came through in other federal program conversations. And so I'm going to put that in the chat box for folks.
So we also have a question around review. Can we review the way expenditures will be reported monthly and verified quarterly? So yes, so the period being covered in your request should be on a monthly basis. So requesting for March and then requesting for April, how much was is being spent on each of those months, and then as far as how this how will it be verified quarterly, if you're expending funds out of the ESSER federal funds, then you'll need to submit an actual quarterly report into the MEF system. So that's something that the business managers do. So if you're not a business manager, you probably don't know what that system is, but it's the Maine education financial system, and so they're uploading from their from your local accounting system into the state's reporting system. So then we have a question around, are you still recommending that we set aside some funds in case there are changes in the guidance for private schools, i.e. private schools being allocated more funding? I'm
going to put it in the chat box, but as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the Council for Chief State School Officers did send an email on behalf of many states explaining to the U.S. Department of Education why they believe there is an issue with the guidance. And the response to that from U.S. Secretary of Education DeVos was, in fact, the district should be prepared to withhold the portion of funding that would be granted to districts if the guidance was followed. So that is absolutely what's in writing, and I will put that letter in the chat box for the group to see.
And so while we have a bit of a lull here, I was asked to kind of speak to budget process, for this fiscal or for FY21 budgets. And so to this point, I haven't seen an executive order around the waiver of public hearings or anything around the budget process for FY21. I know there are multiple parties involved in this because there's different, so this would affect probably the municipal budgets along with school budgets. So they are working on carefully crafting, is my understanding, an executive order around the budget. So we are, or I am sure you are anxiously awaiting that. And I am hoping that, or once that comes out, then I'll schedule a meeting and we can discuss how that'll impact you locally. So so hold on. So, oh, okay. So Carolyn's asking if I can upload the chat box. Yep, I'll clean it up and upload the chat into Teams. So if people want to see it, then they can view it there, because Chelsea is certainly inputting some good links for you to have access to. So I did get a private message around what is the budget approval deadline, and I believe this is to your local budget. So for fiscal year 21, your budget approval deadline is 30 days after the executive or the state of civil emergency ends. So that was in a bill that was passed the last day the legislature was in session. So that's currently the deadline. And what that means is you need to be through the process the first time, because as we all know, sometimes budgets don't pass the first time through, but so you need to be through that process within 30 days after the state of civil emergency ends. So we have a question around graduation. The May 14th FAQ has an answer about furniture when responding to graduation costs. Can you please verify if some costs can be covered? Is that something that you can answer, Chelsea, as far as an allowable cost under the ESSER funds?
I'm pulling it up right now.
Okay.
One moment.
Okay.
So the answer and the question was, can ESSER funds be used to purchase new desks or classroom furniture to accommodate distancing requirements? And the response is the CARES statutory language on allowable uses reflects that LEAs may spend their funds on a wide variety of activities, such as providing principals and other school leaders with the resources necessary to address school needs. Given the guidance that's been provided both by the national CDC and the Maine CDC, we would expect that some districts would make those requests. And we've actually seen some requests in those applications, the dozen or so that we've already received. The link that I just posted, it seems it's not working for some of you, and I think that might be because the document was shared by CCSSO in their shared drive. So I will download it and give it to Tyler so that he can put it in the Teams portal as a PDF.
So I see above, Tara is asking, is there any sort of time frame for the executive order around budgets? And there is no particular date. I mean, I think everybody is just anxiously awaiting for that to come out to see what needs to be, you know, what it'll say. And I do know that MSMA has been part of that conversation, you know, in that trying to take into account all of the different variations on how budgets run through different school districts. So I mean, there's a lot for them to kind of take into account to ensure that in helping out one school district, they're not hurting another school district. So Chelsea, Deb is asking, if I don't have a Part 5 or Part 6 of the application, does that mean there isn't a qualifying private school in my district? She
No.
has 2 listed on her ESEA application. Is the definition different for ESSER?
No, it's a bit different, right? We're following Title I rules, following the statute. But the difference is that we are not making determinations around eligibility as an SEA, because when you follow the law correctly, that is the LEA's rule. So there will be a form that will go out where you can hand over the consultation paperwork to any eligible private non-publics in Maine, and they will fill it out. And so that form will say that, yes, you in fact had consultation, you either agree or do not agree, and then they will sign it. So many of you already have this document. You've been using it for years. We see it during monitoring visits. But if you don't, we'll have a template for you that you can use. The other piece here is that in the application, you're going to say whether or not they agreed and the consultation occurred. You'll provide the date, and then you'll put the information in the application. Because it is abbreviated, only one page, we'll expect to see a clear delineation around this is the private school project. This is the thing that they are doing, that we are managing and remaining the fiscal agent throughout the duration of that project. Tyler, I just sent you the letter, so
Okay.
if you don't know, but we can put that up there in Teams.
Okay. Yep. We'll get that up today. And I still need to upload a video, I think the video from last week, so we can get those up.
Question, private message. What is GEAR again? You mentioned it earlier, but you went over it very quickly. So the CARES Act had many different parts to it, many of which did not go to education. But the education stabilization portion included the governor's emergency education relief, which is the GEAR application, the ESSER, the elementary and secondary schools relief, and higher ed relief. And so all of you are here today because you have applied or will be applying for ESSERF funding, which is for K to 12. But the governor's funding, Maine also received, in addition to the 40+ million, 9.2 million. And every governor in the country received their portion, and then they decided what are the priorities in education. So in Maine, Maine was one of the first states to apply and to receive it. We were one of the first 6. And our #1 priority is connectivity. And so we have a newsroom article that I'm going to put in the chat for everyone so you can read it. But that money that we've been set aside, it's to address connectivity for all kids in Maine that are public school students. And so if you had a need, your tech director, principal, or superintendent was invited to participate in one of 4 previous surveys. And the surveys were asking, how many kids do you have that need simply connectivity, so MiFi hotspot? How many kids need both the hotspot and the device? And how many kids just need a device? And so to date, the department has met over 24,000 requests across the state and continues to meet those requests. As I said, the 4th survey went out most recently, and an order was placed just yesterday. So the first focus was the K to 12 setting, and now Paige Nichols, the department's Chief Innovation Officer, and Beth Lambert, the department's leader in secondary education and innovation. They both are working to connect with districts to make sure the devices arrive. They've also partnered with the department here, our business office, we call it DAF, and they were able to negotiate a very fair price to purchase those devices, and we'll continue to do that work, not only now with K-12, but the community college. When I'm saying qualifying, I'm saying that there are some there are some academies that serve public school kids, as we all know, and they were also able to work with Paige and Beth to make requests. If you have specific equitable services questions, we can take those one-on-one. I know many communities have different situations, but I don't want to confuse the equitable services conversation with the GEAR conversation because they're very different. Some states did make allocations to districts with their GEAR funds. Maine did not do that. Rather than just giving a few small allocations out, Maine said there is a large need for connectivity, and we're going to work to address those needs so that all kids can receive instruction and support from educators, even while they're at home during this really difficult time. The other part of the GEAR funding is connectivity and an online learning platform. So there will be teachers from across the state that will be able to create lessons and record them, and they'd be available on this platform. So that's the GEAR funding. We don't talk about GEAR much on here because this is the ESSER office hours, but we did have Beth and Paige join us a few times over the past few weeks just to create kind of that conversation so that folks know, if they didn't already know, there is this GEAR program and this connectivity effort underway. And that's also why we're calling you if we see that you're spending all of your money on connectivity for ESSER. We just want to make sure that you're aware of the other programming that's available to possibly support your kiddos. So senior banners, this question here, I'm sorry if I wasn't more clear, the FAQs talk about furniture, and this is a question about senior banners and things of the like. That is something we would need to ask. It's harder to make a clear connection between senior banners than you would say a divider to keep kiddos not being as close to their peers. So I will add that to our list that will go to our program director later today.
So we'll give just another minute or so in case anybody is currently typing a message, or if they want to raise their hand and ask their question.
I have a message asking for the contact information for the Women Leading the Year project. So I'm putting that here in the chat box. If you are wondering more about it or wondering if your district participated, you can email Paige Nichols, our Chief Innovation Officer, Beth Lambert.
So I have a question around, can face shields, masks, and infrared thermometers be entered under operation maintenance? That would be better placed under student supports, because that's where the nurse's office is, and those are more, even though they may not necessarily be being used primarily by the nurse, it's to help with a health need. So that would be the better location for that type of expense. And I do have a couple of business manager questions in here, and I'll address those after we end the recording. And so Wendy's asking, are we saying gear, G-E-A-R, and I think it's actually G-E-E-R, or if you want to put that into the chat, Chelsea.
Yes, I just did.
Yep. Okay.
So for those of you interested, I've also put in a link for the methodology for how the allocations were made to state, and additional information for the federal government about the year.
So barring any other questions, I'm going to end the recording.